Carl Jung spent real time and real scholarly effort studying the life and writings of a physician who had lived and worked centuries before him, a wandering doctor and philosopher whose reputation was, by Jung's own account, genuinely difficult to summarize cleanly, since the man had been contradictory, chaotic, and one-sided in equal measure, and yet had exerted an extraordinary and lasting influence on the generations of thinkers who came after him. What drew Jung's attention most powerfully was a single foundational distinction this old physician had insisted upon throughout his often bewildering body of work, a distinction between two entirely different sources of genuine knowledge available to a human being. The first source, the old physician called the light of revelation, referring to the received wisdom of established religious and scholarly tradition, knowledge that came down through sacred texts, through the accumulated teaching of recognized authorities, through the careful study of books written by others who had come before. This was, in his time, the overwhelmingly dominant and respected source of legitimate knowledge, the kind of learning a serious and educated person was expected to acquire through years of formal study under established teachers. But this old physician insisted with real and often controversial force that there existed a second and equally legitimate source of genuine knowledge, one he called the light of nature. This was not knowledge acquired through books or through the teaching of established authorities. It was knowledge available directly through careful, humble, patient observation of nature itself, and above all, through attention to the innate, instinctive wisdom that nature had placed directly within the human body and the human psyche. Wisdom that did not need to be taught by any external authority because it was, in some sense, already present within the observer, waiting only to be noticed and trusted rather than acquired from outside. This was a genuinely radical claim for its time, and it put the old physician into direct and often dangerous conflict with the established medical and religious authorities of his era, who considered the accumulated wisdom of ancient texts and recognized teachers to be the only legitimate foundation for real knowledge. He insisted, controversially, that a humble country healer who had spent years attentively observing the actual behavior of illness and the actual effects of natural remedies, guided by careful observation and a kind of instinctive attunement to nature, rather than by formal study of ancient texts, might genuinely possess real medical wisdom that a formally credentialed physician, working entirely from inherited theory without any real attention to direct observation, could completely lack. Jung found this old distinction genuinely important for understanding a pattern he observed constantly in his own psychological work. Centuries later, a pattern that had nothing directly to do with medicine, but everything to do with how a person actually comes to genuine self-understanding. He noticed that his own patients, and indeed most people generally, tended to seek understanding of themselves and their own inner lives almost exclusively through something closely resembling the light of revelation, external teaching, received wisdom from books, therapists, religious authorities, or the general received opinion of their surrounding culture about what a healthy and meaningful life was supposed to look like. This external wisdom was not without genuine value, and Jung never suggested it should be dismissed. But he observed that people who relied on it exclusively, without ever developing any real trust in their own direct, instinctive, embodied wisdom, tended to remain curiously disconnected from their own genuine inner reality, capable of reciting correct and well-informed opinions about psychological health without ever actually experiencing the kind of direct, felt, embodied self-understanding that Jung believed was the actual foundation of real psychological wholeness. The old physician's light of nature, translated into Jung's own psychological terms, pointed toward something he considered absolutely essential and yet remarkably neglected in modern life: the capacity to actually trust and attend to your own direct, instinctive, bodily, and emotional wisdom rather than relying exclusively on external authorities to tell you what you should think, feel, or understand about your own inner experience. This did not mean abandoning external teaching and received wisdom entirely, any more than the old physician had suggested doctors should ignore everything ever written by previous generations of healers. It meant developing a second and equally legitimate source of knowledge alongside the first, a genuine willingness to notice and trust what your own direct, felt experience was actually telling you, even when this direct experience did not perfectly match what external authorities and received wisdom said you were supposed to be feeling or thinking. Hume observed that this capacity for trusting direct, instinctive self-knowledge had been genuinely eroded in modern life, precisely because modern culture placed such overwhelming emphasis on external, credentialed, book-based knowledge as the only legitimate form of understanding, treating direct instinct and bodily wisdom as unreliable at best and primitive superstition at worst. This left many people in a curious and quietly painful position, capable of describing psychological health in sophisticated and well-informed language, borrowed entirely from external sources, while remaining genuinely out of touch with their own direct, felt, instinctive sense of what was actually true for them personally underneath all the borrowed theory. This distinction offers a genuinely useful practical question for anyone trying to better understand their own inner life. When you form a belief or an understanding about yourself, your feelings, or your own situation, is that understanding coming primarily from the light of revelation, from what you have been taught, read, or told by external authorities about what you should be thinking and feeling? Or is it coming, at least in part, from the light of nature, your own direct, patient, honest attention to what your actual felt experiences? Genuinely telling you, independent of what any external source says you ought to be experiencing. And beginning, Jung believed genuine psychological health required both sources working together, but he observed that most people in modern life had become so thoroughly reliant on the first source that the second had been allowed to atrophy almost entirely, leaving them strangely disconnected from their own most direct and trustworthy source of self-knowledge. There is a particular discipline worth developing if you want to strengthen this second, neglected source of wisdom, a discipline the old physician himself practiced throughout his unconventional and wandering life. It involves deliberately setting aside, at least temporarily, what you have been taught you should feel or think about a given situation in your own life, and instead patiently and honestly attending to what you actually directly feel in your body and in your immediate emotional experience before any external interpretation has been layered on top of it. This is genuinely difficult, precisely because most people have spent an entire lifetime training themselves to reach immediately for external, borrowed interpretation, rather than pausing long enough to notice their own direct, unmediated experience first. Think honestly about how you typically come to understand your own feelings and your own inner life. Do you tend to reach quickly for external explanation, for what a book, a therapist, or common cultural wisdom says you should be feeling in a given situation? Or do you also make genuine space for the light of nature, your own direct, patient, honest attention to what you are actually experiencing, independent of any external framework telling you what that experience ought to mean? If you can identify a recent moment when you trusted external explanation over your own direct felt experience, or the reverse, right below the single word for what your own direct instinct was actually telling you in that moment. Naming it honestly is often the first step toward developing the second, neglected source of wisdom this old physician insisted no person should ever fully abandon. Because the old and often difficult physician Carl Jung, studied so carefully, was never simply arguing about medicine when he insisted on the second source of knowledge. He was pointing towards something Jung would spend his entire career developing further, the conviction that real wisdom has never come from books and teachers alone, but also from the patient, humble willingness to trust what your own nature, honestly attended to, has been quietly trying to tell you all along.